So what's a question, when do I recognize or think about racial differences?
Yes.
Okay. I guess that's a little bit hard for me to answer because I've ended up a lot of my studies about race, so I'm going to guess I might think about it more than maybe other whites do. So again, just from the experience of talking, though, to students in my classes, my impression when I talk to white students is that they think about race when they're in a situation that they're the numerical minority, which doesn't happen very often. Some folks will mention like going to a restaurant, like an Asian restaurant, something along those lines, or also situations where they think about race when they're talking about it in class. And so I get that comment a lot. But I also have done, trying to sort of just reflect on this, interviews with adult white Southerners who, the same pattern when I ask folks about when do you think about race, the majority would say not very often, that it's not something they think about or that really crosses their mind very much. So my assumption would be that a lot of whites, when they're watching television, and this is just an assumption I'm making off of kind of this anecdotal evidence, is that I doubt that most whites notice the composition of tables and the restaurant commercials and things like that. I think I tune into it just because this is, sort of what I teach about, but I'm going to guess that that's probably not something that's very much in the consciousness of everyday whites.
Just from a personal perspective, the times that I notice racial difference most, aside from tonight, it's before the conversation happens. It's when I'm encountering my own preconceptions before meeting the human being. And as soon as the conversation starts, that changes dramatically, and then it's just us. But before the conversation starts between myself and a person of color, that there's sort of unformed questions in the back of my mind, often not conscious, I think, sometimes conscious, depending on the situation. But just to be honest, I think that's what I experience. But it's always before the conversation. It's not usually in the conversation.
There's another question from the audience. From a whiteness point of view, how does the lack of effective preschool training for poor and underprivileged youngsters affect the success in secondary schooling and their futures, and the nation's future, I guess? So let me read that again. How does the lack of effective preschool training for poor and underprivileged youth or children affect their success in secondary schooling and the future of this nation? Any takers?
Well, I don't want to dominate here. Lack of satisfactory, early education for any kid is a setback, and I think, unfortunately, some communities suffer from that more than others. But and that probably is related. I mean, the proportionality of resources available to certain communities, unfortunately, has often got racial correlations. But it's definitely a setback, no matter what your color. And I was going to say something else about that. But there's also the historic momentum behind a lot of this separateness and disproportionality that has yet to be overcome. And that's, to me, the sad part from a race relations point of view is we still have not made up for the disproportionate under support or support for one community and another.
Thank you. This question is for Professor Rodriguez. Are there any groups that are currently striving to become more white as they become more American?
I don't think it's a question of whether or not they're consciously striving to become more white. I think that given the idea that whiteness is normative, that whiteness has come to be defined by a series of tastes. It's a taste culture. And I was thinking of using myself as an example. You know, in my bio at the beginning, it mentions golf and snowboarding. And I don't think it gets much whiter than golf and snowboarding, right? And that has nothing to do with you know, me aspiring to join whiteness as a class. Yet those markers, we understand them as being white, right? And a lot of those markers are connected to economic prosperity and economic well-being, which is what most immigrants want. So as you move up the ladder, as you become more Americanized and more affluent, the range of choices to express whiteness come to dominate. You move to the suburbs, right? You become a nuclear family. You immerse yourself in traditional educational schools rather than, say, Jewish school or, you know, German language school, right? You go to the same schools that all the peers go to, and you become another sort of white-bread Latino, I guess, for lack of a better explanation. And again, it's not a conscious process, but it is one that has a series of benefits. I had a friend in grad school, Wayne Marshall, Jewish kid from Miami, who would accuse me of being whiter than he was, because I snowboarded, because I played golf, because my language skills were better than his, because I had the advantage of going to an English-speaking school from the time I was in preschool. So my English is perfect. My Spanish, now, sadly, not so much. But you know, originally I had both of those language skills. But the fact that I didn't speak broken language or broken English, the fact that I was of a certain stature, of a certain skin color, right, and then I had this taste culture that smacked of white, you know, allows me to check that Hispanic non-white box. No, the Hispanic box, not the Hispanic non-white box. But as I think Ashley's work alludes to, were I in Texas, I would find it much more difficult, right, to check the Hispanic box as opposed to the Hispanic non-white box, because my skin color would be more remarkable in Texas. Right, and those taste cultures would be very different. I would be much more aware of trying to express a connection to a Hispanic community in a way that I'm kind of completely divorced of that in Lynchburg, Virginia, you know, at Randolph College, right, sort of immersed in this liberal educational bastion that caters overwhelmingly to affluent white middle class and upper middle class kids, right? I hope I answered that question.
We are committed to beginning to wrap up in a couple of minutes and finishing no later than 8:30. So with that in mind, we'll whip through the next few questions and hope that maybe we will give rise to some more opportunities for conversation and instead of easy answers, of which there are none.
Which one was I doing next? I'll do this one. What will whiteness mean when soon the majority of Americans are multiracial? Will we celebrate then our cultural diversity? Anyone want to take that one? Any takers? I'll start here. I'll make someone.
Well, we can leave it as a question. We don't have to answer that.
No, that's true.
Well, I'm not very good at predicting the future. I was just going to say I hope so. You know, I mean, it's just gotten kind of boring. You know, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the next generations as America becomes more multicultural, more less homogenous. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and when I grew up there, I went to an integrated school which had about 5 black kids, and everybody else was white. You know, suburban, middle class. Everybody drove the same station wagon with wood on the side, you know, and listened to the same crappy records. And, you know, it just, Northern Virginia is so not that now. You know, when I went to George Mason University, you could hear any language being spoken on any corner of that campus. And I thought that was exhilarating and also kind of unnerving a little bit. But, you know, you go up to Arlington now, it is nothing like it was when I grew up. And I wonder if that is the future of our country, you know, over time. Maybe so, you know. If so, it's become a place where people have less consciousness of ethnic diversity because it's in their face all day long, you know, and there's not this black and white division because there are people from all over the world. And up there, you know, your issue is access to power through employment and through, you know, language ability and, you know, your mobility in a very affluent society. But it's not the way it has been over the last 50 years in more rural places within America. You know, it's like there are different grades of assimilation throughout the country, and I'm just interested to see what happens over time.
My only thought on that is what it's going to be like. It'll be okay. It's and if folks who look like me do the work of accommodating themselves to believing it'll be okay, because what I think part of what we experience in this society is the anxiety brought about by the demographic shifts, and that. And the uncertainty, oh my God, what's that going to do to the structure of power and the meaning of privilege and the possibilities for, you know, it's like, well, wait a minute, I thought the social contract was because I'm white, I'm in a position of privilege, and what if that's not true anymore? Talk about anxiety. So, I mean, but it'll be okay.
I'm going to use that response to segue into the next question, which deals with integration in churches. Leslie wanted me to share a little bit about my dissertation topic, which is on the integration of the Episcopal Diocese of Southwestern Virginia, and what happened with that was the bishop at the time insisted on integration and folded small black churches into larger white churches. And there was the invitation to come and be like us. And not explicit, but implicit. That's what's implied in that folding in together, because there still exists the imbalance of power. And what happens is that the segregation continues within the integrated institution. Whereas a contrasting study of neighboring dioceses in the surrounding areas might illustrate that the less, I would say, right-minded bishops allowed segregation to continue, and today, the unintended consequence is that the diocese that integrated in the 1950s and 1960s has a very small African-American population today. The dioceses that did not integrate, that remained segregated, have healthy African-American and white populations today. So this leads into this next question. Churches, for the most part, in this area are not integrated. Is this an important issue? And if not, why? If yes, why and what should be done?
This is actually probably not the question I should answer because I don't know a whole lot about religion, but it just made me think, though, that in some of the interviews I did with white and black Southerners, I just recall several African American respondents who talked about not wanting churches to integrate and appreciating and enjoying their uniquely African American church. So, and that just kind of got me thinking about the idea of yes, we're all one people, but I also think that that there's I don't know how to articulate this well, but people also have groups have unique features that make them special as well. So I don't know if blending everyone into a like homogenous future of like the sort of melting pot idea is always the right answer. That there's a way for there to be a balance there.
Anyone else?
Oh, all right. I suppose being a minister, I should answer this one. I think it is important, but I think the world of religion is pulled in many different directions around the issue of race, and I think that on the one hand, I mean, there are some folks that cleave to their church for a sense of social identity, as opposed to those who associate with a particular congregation for a sense of good spiritual fit. And so, which tends to draw in a more diverse crowd in terms of ethnicity and background. But when that happens, it's very important that we not only lift up the values that gather us together, but honor the differences that we bring in the door, which are more than just race. The life experiences that shape each of us are unique and different, and we all bring something unique and individual to the table and into the community, and it's in community where the values or the way that we live out our values is tested and given greater power. So I think that there's so many sides to that question, and we're still working on trying to get that right.
Thank you. Here's a question, and it's fairly long, so I'm trying to get it all out. In education, the federal government requires schools to report data in subgroups, white, African American, economically disadvantaged, etc. Across the nation, African American students are performing far below white students. How important is it for educators to continue these discussions, especially since all of our youth are our future? Performance of all students. So how important is that? And then does anyone have suggestions about how to have these discussions in a profession that is led predominantly by white people who may not see this as important?
I think anytime you're dealing with students, and I don't like the term subgroups because sub means less than, and I think when you are categorizing folks as less than, you are using language that is slightly denigrating to those folks. But I think when you have, I think that's always the issue that we need to dialogue about. Why is it important to put people in categories and track what's going on? We have to do it because we're not doing it well to make sure that all children are educated the way they need to. I get asked a lot, why aren't we just colorblind? And I think until we get to that point, until we get to the point where all of our children are performing at the top of their capabilities, then it's going to be very important to track who's not doing well so that we make sure that we are providing adequate services. That means folks need to understand what it means to teach a low-income white kid who lives in a trailer park, or a kid who lives in middle to upper middle class neighborhoods, or kids who happen to be of mixed race. We need to understand what it means to be all of those kids. That's why it's important to also understand why it's important to have those, to be as open as possible with the way in which we allow people to identify themselves. Because if we're forcing people into boxes, then again, we're putting ourselves in a position where somebody else is defining who we are, and then that just helps add to the conflict that we're continually fighting. That's all I want to say.
In 2 minutes or less, you all are doing a great job, by the way. We have 3 questions left, and so 2 minutes or less on each of these next 3. How does white privilege impact economic opportunity? We can leave it as a question unless somebody's leaping at the microphone. How does white privilege impact economic opportunity?
Say I'll touch it. I think it kind of goes without saying that if you're white, or if you have been moving in white circles, as I kind of have, I identify as American Indian, but nothing precludes me from accessing the structures of power that white people have access to. And I have to be aware of that because I come from a group of people who didn't have access to public education until 1962 in Amherst County. So had I grown up there then, I would not have been able to have a graduate education. I would not be getting a PhD. It wouldn't be on my radar. And when we took our elders down to institutions of higher learning, they cried because they realized that their grandkids have access to this whole world that was denied to them. So to say, you know, whiteness is access to economic opportunity, it is. You know, there are still people who make things easier for you if they perceive that you are within their group. It's easier to get a mortgage. It's easier to learn the English language. It's easier to come up through that whole system that is designed to create civic competence in American society, and which was designed for American school children who were perceived to be white. You know, up until very recently, the stories were written for white kids about white people. And so, you know, what I often say in my work is, you know, at least 75% of the people who participated in history, their stories were excluded. You know, we don't even have their perspectives. And so it has been all about this perception. And that's what we have to be aware of, not to feel guilt or to say, you know, everything is so terrible about our country or how it has been, but to say, let's just be aware of what assumptions we're bringing to the questions that we ask.
We're going to have 2 more questions. Does the existence of race-identified institutions such as BET or the NAACP prevent us from moving forward towards seeing past race? I know Leslie started out with, we first must take account of race. I don't know if we can see past it, but does anyone want to touch on that question?
I guess I just don't see BET as a great hindrance towards racial reconciliation.
All right, the final question is, I don't think the elephant will ever disappear. It may grow smaller or take on different shapes or even, at some point, different colors. That said, how can we break down barriers while building unity?
I think I mentioned this before. It's just giving ourselves permission to have the conversation. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be taking a group of 50 high school students to a weekend camp experience where they're going to be staying at a camp for almost the equivalent of 2 days, where we're talking about race and race relations at their school. How can things be better if they think race or any other diversity related issue is a concern for them at school? And helping them with that conversation so that they can go back into their school and encourage that and engage their peers. And then hopefully we're creating opportunities for that to occur within the middle school, and then for the middle schoolers to go into the elementary school. So it's we have to start somewhere, and we need to encourage it with our young people, because if they're not having the conversation, there's going to be a panel like this 50 years from now asking the same questions. What is whiteness? Blah, 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 blah. What are we going to do about it? And we got to do it.
Just occurs to me, you say 50 years from now, but it occurs to me, I doubt that a panel like this could have been assembled 50 years ago in Lynchburg. So I'm just saying.
Anyone else want to touch on that?
But any closing comments before we turn it over to Leslie, who's going to give us our next instruction?
I just want to plug the Dialogue on Race in the City of Charlottesville. There's a pamphlet back there that gives you a highlight on some of the things that we've done over the past year. We've been in place since 2009. Thank you. We've been in place since 2009. We sort of started to take our cues from what Lynchburg started, and we've been very, very fortunate, very blessed to have the financial resources to do a lot of things that Charlottesville needs to have happen because of its history. Like I said, I grew up in Cincinnati. I didn't know anything about massive resistance until I came to this state, and my head was blown off with the things that I learned about that happened in Virginia, and then even more when I learned about what happened in Charlottesville. So we're trying to work on those things. So please take a brochure.
All right, why don't we give our panelists a round of applause for coming out. And thank you for coming tonight to this wonderful conversation. It started with an idea. We talked about it. I've had conversations in small groups over dinner with other people, and it finally came to fruition. I want the committee, people who are involved in the committee, Community Education Committee, to stand, and the people who are on the advisory board for the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism, please stand, because this could not happen without all of these people being involved. And I'd like to add, even though Charlottesville took their cues from Lynchburg, and Charlottesville's Community Dialogue is still very much a city initiative, the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism, Many Voices, One Community, is now a community initiative. And if the community wants this to remain and stay, then the community has to invest in this initiative. I think we recognize that it's important, and we can continue to have conversations like this. And this is a start to this particular conversation. We will organize another small group to continue to talk about, okay, what can we do? And I think this is just a start of a public conversation on what whiteness means, and we will continue that. We have your information. If you have not given us your email address, please make sure you give that to us. I want to also tell you that in November, on November 12th, and I think it will be here, I just need to, yes, we're going to have a workshop called Interfacing with Difference, and Pam Lobb from the University of Virginia will be facilitating that for us in this room, and that will be an interactive discussion. That's for Native American History Month. We usually have Karenne come, and she's been so wonderful to come and do that. And as we look forward, we are going to have a conversation about talking to your kids about race. So that's something that we're looking at doing, and and we're open to ideas and suggestions and working with you. The goal is large, but we need everyone to be involved in making racial equity a reality in Lynchburg. And I just want to thank the panelists for your willingness to share your experience and your expertise with everyone. And we've had this conversation, and this may also come to fruition. We may actually have a conference or symposium with many workshops and more panels of this nature, and hopefully in the coming year. We've kind of had some conversation about that, but our hope is we want to bring other people together to continue to bring our minds, share what we can do, share our ideas so that we can move forward in Lynchburg. Thank you once again for coming out, and have a good night.